My name is Rachel Allison. I'm the district forester out of North Platte, and I'm also the forestry test writer. So I usually always work on the regional contest and then the state contest too. How many of you were here last year in January? Couple, 3, 4. And then what about this summer in Gothenburg? No, 1, 2 maybe? Trying to remember. That was a long time ago. Well, Erica sent out an email kind of wondering, what we were going to talk about, because then it would determine if you guys came back and heard the same old story again. So what I decided to do is take a little bit of time on silviculture today. So we're going to kind of talk about managing a forest. So I'm not going to try to rattle through, everything about forestry. Last year what we did is we covered the tools, tree ID, we did a bunch of stuff. So, and we can't cover everything in one sitting. So what I want to go through is silviculture, and that's managing trees. We're going to go through and you've got a handout so you can kind of see where we're headed. But basically, if I'm going to meet with a property owner about their woodland, we're going to try to figure out, we've got to identify the trees. That's what we covered last year. Are we talking about walnut, pine, oak, whatever? All that's going to determine. And why I'm talking about this is because a lot of the test questions are management questions. Why do trees, how do they grow? What's a site index? What's all this stuff? And so sometimes forestry is one, I don't just have, it was really great to hear the wildlife. I hope I picked up a couple tips, but it's not memorizing coyote species or beaver species. It's not kind of a memorization. So it's a little harder. So that's why I want to just take some time to maybe help you figure out a little bit the general concept of it that then you can pass on to your students. So the first part is if I'm walking up to something, and also if the guys, when we Gehring, Ponca, wherever we go for the state contest, that's what they should be thinking. Or you could talk to them on the way. What forest are we headed to? It might be the Rivers Zoo at Scotts Bluff, but are we headed to a hardwood forest? Are we headed to a pine forest? Those are the kinds of things that help them, because sometimes I'll get an answer on the sheet and they'll tell me that they have a cottonwood when we're standing in a pine forest. And that just doesn't work. So sometimes understanding the forest will help them to know what kind of species there might be. So also then we look at the forest health issues, determine whether the tree grows in shade or does not like shade, and that's intolerance to shade, and some silvicultural practices, and then some treatments. So what we're going to cover a little bit, the practices are like a clear cut, shelter wood, seed tree. Those are a lot of the multiple choice question. How many of you guys do talk about forestry with your team? What are some of your, I'm just seeing a few blank spaces, blank looks. So what are some of the issues that you have with forestry? Or maybe you guys know it already, and I'm here, but I just, yeah.
Well, since we're in somewhat of an urban setting,
yeah.
The fact that I take it through town,
yes.
We can identify, here's an area that was built in the 30s and 40s, here's the trees that are here. Here's a pin of oaks from the 50s and 60s, but the monoculture, and that we want to diversify our culture, or what's growing.
For the urban forest.
Yeah.
And that's great, and definitely for tree ID, but Envirothon is the rural forest, not the urban forest. So it can help, especially the differing pine, Scotch pine, Austrian pine, ponderosa pine, whatever, and even homeowners don't know, they talk about the pine they have, and I go out there and it's a spruce. It's just kind of an evergreen thing. So, but that, at least it's there. Even at the schoolyard, it's there, for some trees. Anything else that's just kind of...
The hard part of teaching is that there aren't any trees.
You
the
d-
whole town.
Okay, okay.
And so, like, you can't really do tree ID, and it's just really challenging
Uh-huh.
to do tree ID with
Okay. And,
county trees.
and where are you located?
Sumner.
Sumner? Okay. And then is there, and I know sometimes it gets even harder to go take field trips to maybe a riparian area or something. So, I mean, that's even more of a struggle. So I might just check with you after this to see where you are, because one at the very end, and circle it when you just flip to the back page, your local district forester, they can come in to your class if you can.
Can't bring trees.
No, but they
problem
can bring samples, and they can
Yeah,
maybe try to work
right.
things out, and they can understand your situation better than I can from North Platte. So, but
When you're asking them to identify trees,
uh-huh.
what do you give them? Do you give them the nut, the bark,
It's the live tree
so they,
growing in that setting.
so never just parts? So
The-
you can
no,
get
and
close with
The one
leaves.
thing, and then in the regional contest, what I've switched to is I used to have that in the kits, but I would hand out, all the regional contests would have a black walnut. Some of the kits were handing out the pine cone. Yeah. So I've done away with that. So I have a laminated sheet, so they don't actually get to touch anything anymore because it gets all mixed up.
And so what will they,
They will
Like
see a
just takes
picture. But it'll be a picture of a leaf, a nut, the bark, all
so
of that.
if you just taught leaf ID, which you could do on worksheets, then you would be okay?
Might know part of it, yeah.
So no.
And they have the Trees of Nebraska book. To key it, they can actually key it out. They have that to help them key it out.
Okay.
Because I do not expect them to memorize. They actually learning how to key is what you do when you're out in the forest. You key it out till you know it. So they do have that is part of the contest. So if
Problem
you,
is getting the specimens in your classroom.
yeah, okay. Well, you may be a little different, so let's just hold, I'll talk to you after but I don't want to run into Nadine's time.
So would you use the Arbor Day, I mean, they have a site and they kind of go through a process?
You can use that.
Is that the same?
That's one way of doing it. One of the things that, I'm trying to think if it's on there on the study guide, but it mentioned the Trees of Nebraska. I didn't bring one with me. The Trees of Nebraska book. That's available through the University of Nebraska.
You can get those EDFs online.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Sounds like tree ID is a thing that we should do every year. Okay, so the silvicultural practices, what's a clear cut, shelter wood, seed tree, the group selection, single tree selection, and then the different treatments. That's kind of what we're talking about. And the silviculture is how we manage trees. And why am I talking about silviculture? It's like one term. The problem is this one term encompasses about 100 other things because it's how we manage, how we cut, how we harvest, how we thin, how we plant, how we prune. This is the whole crux of forestry, is how we manage trees. So this would be something, if you can kind of get it in an understanding of when you go out to a forested area, it could be a river area, it could be the Pine Ridge, or oaks down by Rouleau, Nebraska, or wherever, or northeast, then that's how we're going to manage that. How is a landowner going to try to improve to get something from it? It could be income, it could be wildlife, it could be water quality. So it's whatever that property owner wants is how we go ahead and manage it. And this also talks about the prescription that's, fits within our societal objectives that we have. So typically the norm is that people will be trying to maybe log something. Nebraska's a little different because we haven't been through 3 or 4 logging cycles like they have in New England and the Pacific Northwest. But some people have just, since the trees were planted by, I used to ask Arbor Day, kids at Arbor Day, who started Arbor Day, they'd say Johnny Appleseed. So, but before that, they knew that it was J. Sterling Morton, and then it kind of somehow reverted to Johnny Appleseed, which is a good guy too. Silvicultural methods, one of the things that when we talk about how to get that forest to produce either timber, logs, mast, those are all words that we have to know. However we do that, we go through those steps to produce and grow trees. So one of the things that's really important is to understand the difference between tolerance and intolerance to shade. So tolerance means that the tree can grow under shade. And intolerance is that it likes to be out in the sun. And intermediate is in between. So a tolerant tree, in the foreground you can see there that there's a little oak seedling, sapling, and it's going to do fine in that shade. Some trees can adapt to both, like in the intermediate, and there may be a seed source, the acorns are there, but they may not do as well in the shade. They may do better when that squirrel will carry it out to the edge of the forest, and those will survive better because they like the sun. One of the things that's really important, I was going through, looking at some of the lists you'll see in a little bit. They listed eastern red cedar as intolerant. And we know that. Look at the open fields. People haven't been farming anymore. Eastern red cedar will move in. That's why everybody's trying to remove all of their cedar. But how many of you have seen all those cedar growing under those groves of cottonwood? So they also are tolerant of shade, aren't they? So when you go to the Google Earth, when you go to any search engine and you see on Wikipedia, all these are tolerant, all these are intolerant, all these are intermediate. Think about what you see, and if I can totally relate to not knowing the species. But if you know some of them, think, well, and that's why what I've done here is I'm going to provide a list to help us kind of understand what's happening in Nebraska, because that's kind of, if anything, I want you to look forward to maybe your team going to national, but if you can understand Nebraska, the concepts of it, that'll help you be prepared for the next step. So intermediate is in between. Some pines are tolerant and intolerant. And then the intolerant, sometimes these are called pioneer species. Does anybody know of a hardwood that's a pioneer species? It grows here in Nebraska. Any idea? Didn't know if this came up before and you've studied about forestry and you know what a pioneer species is. Bur oak. Do you ever study about climax and succession and what moves out in the prairie? What grows out in the prairie? Grasses. What happens when it changes over to shrubs? And then trees move in. So what would be moving in first would be the pioneer trees. Trees that can stand the sun. So what's going to be more of a tolerant one is something, think of New England. All those shade trees. What's going to grow up in the shade? So that's the difference. Kind of think of West as intolerant, and that's not literally true, but
What do you call the second group of trees that grow, like the trees that would be established after the pioneer species?
well, I don't number them. I don't have 1, 2. What I'm talking about are categories of tolerant tolerant to shade, intolerant to shade, and then intermediate is in between. There may be, and this is not clear cut. So if I went to someone's farm and if it was on the river area, typically what will start in a riparian is elm, ash, and cottonwood. That's a riparian. It's in your Nebraska Resources NEB guide. What can move in on a second tier away from the river is hackberry could move in. But hackberry could be an intolerant, but yet it's growing in the shade of these trees. So every site is going to be different. You can't just say, okay, well, we're in this classroom and so there are chairs and tables. That doesn't happen out on person A's property and person B property. It's going to be all different. It's going to depend on the climate, the weather, the rain, no rain, how they use it, if they run cows. And so one of the multiple choice questions on the test, how come our forests decline? Why do they decline? What do trees need to grow? Water, soil, if they like shade, if they like sun. And then they can't grow because drought, the weather may change. People run cows, people bulldoze and put in a home, urban, just like, was that Marcia that was here? I didn't catch her name. What was, Monica? Thank you. She talked about the tall grass prairie going away because of urban sprawl, urban development. The same thing happens with forestry. We're losing because of putting in pivots. So that's what, it's not all clear cut. It just depends, unfortunately. So intolerant are called pioneer species. Now, here's a tree ID. Anybody have an idea what this is? Go ahead. Yes. So that, where do we have that growing?
Northwestern Nebraska.
Yes, and so that is, for example, in western US, the intolerant to shade would be your ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, and western larch. Those are just examples. The tolerant ones, and this is not western Nebraska, all across, tolerant to shade are hemlock, the sequoia, and the Sitka spruce. Okay, so they will grow in, will do well in shade. Now, the whole point is, if you're up in northwest Nebraska and you're in the ponderosa pine forest, there'll be little pine trees growing in the shade, won't there be? Will they do well? They might, depends. Nebraska did not get damaged and the mountain pine beetle did not survive because our pine forests are too spread out and too thin. They're not as dense in numbers as the Black Hills, you know, the Rocky Mountains in Canada. So that some of it can be helpful. Some trees get a disease because they're not getting the kind of sunlight that they might need to be growing healthier. So that's an example of intolerant and tolerant. In the eastern United States, they've got the eastern cottonwood, Kentucky coffee tree, yellow poplar. That bottom picture is actually a stand of, go for it. Hard to tell without leaves. But that's, yes, that's exactly what cottonwood looks like. So, and they are intolerant, and one of the things to try to relate to this, you're going to see in a little bit, is intolerant comes up all at one time. So they all get sunlight. If we have a mature forest and then we have some little stuff coming in underneath, we'll have mature trees, medium trees, understory trees. Here, they're all the same age, aren't they? If you see sometime on the river area, and you know, I don't always get to the river, but you'll see that a lot of the cottonwood, they'll come up all at one time on the river. So that's why we manage it, because of how they respond. So that's how we try to work with that forest. The tolerant in the eastern US would be the sugar maple. So what would be kind of cool, sometimes you see pictures, you know, and they talk about collecting the sap for syrup. So how they manage that is they will have a mature forest, and they'll probably want to keep that mature forest. They'll take out a tree that's dying and then let a new one grow up, but they won't clear cut the whole thing and start all over, because they can handle the shade. So that's the difference, is no shade and shade. So Nebraska, again, we've got the pine forest, hardwoods, riparian forests. And here's a picture of the ponderosa pine forest with some saplings coming up underneath it. And then a big specimen on the right. Very much wanting that sunlight.
So you're saying with shade intolerant, we do more even age harvest and clear cut so that you can replace them all at the same time?
Correct. And you're just right on target. So coming up here, and you can look ahead on your sheet too. So what we want to do, and here's kind of exactly that category that might help you. Even aged on the left is when we're dealing with the intolerant to shade. So we can do a clear cut, and you know, if you think about Babe, well, I can't think how to say that. Babe was the ox, Paul Bunyan. You know, huge clear cuts, and we don't really do that anymore, but we still do try to have clear cuts so we have openings. They may be 40 acres instead of 500 acres, something like that. But on the left are all of the ones to have the even age. On the right is the uneven aged forest. So you have the mature overstory trees, the intermediate trees, and the understory trees. And so they can be developing at the same time. Typically, the even age will be a single species. The one on the right is going to be a diverse species too. They might be 2 or 3 that are growing up together. So here is, if you have even aged versus uneven aged, you're going to have intolerant is even age management and tolerant is uneven aged management. And so the goal is what we were trying to do in even aged management, the heading, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I don't trip up and say the wrong thing either to confuse you guys. So even aged management, what we want to do is remove enough to get the sunlight again on the forest floor. All of these trees on the right are the same height. So that's kind of diameter and height kind of equates age. So when we do measurements, which we did last year here, we talked about the diameter and figuring out the basal area so we could figure out volume. So if those are all about, say, 10 inches in diameter, they may be about 20 years old. I mean, just depends on the species and where they're growing, if they have a lot of rainfall or they don't. But they're all the same. So that's why they can come up together. The top of them all have sun. And so then the trees are the same aged, and so that even age management is for intolerant species. And then we'll log that at a certain time, and it might be the rotation will be when those trees are mature enough and they are sellable at a certain size. Sometimes we might do oaks that are as big as, not quite that big, but huge. And some things, like for pulp paper, they'll turn that over quicker and they'll just mash it and make pulp and paper. So that all depends on what the end product is. And then the key to replace that cut harvest is either to leave some seed trees to naturally regenerate, or if it's clear cut, then that will be planted. Sometimes, by a crew or something like that. But so if you've ever traveled and you have seen in, like the Pacific Northwest or New England where they have patches open, they will, sometimes they'll leave the trees. We'll show that in just a second here. So uneven is clear cutting, removing all trees, shelter belt. Generally, you're leaving about 20 trees an acre, and the seed tree could be a few up to 20. That's all variable depending on what kind of type of tree. I've seen a lot less, I've seen a lot more. I may see 2 or 3 trees per acre. So here is an example of a clear cut. All trees are cut out, leaving full sunlight, so that needs to be seeded and then reforested. Except that this is eastern red cedar, so we are not going to we want grass back there for my cows. So this is even-aged management. We're still talking about that. This is what a shelter wood looks like. That's where they have left a scattering of trees to get some seeds to drop and grow there and get a mini forest started that will be all the same species. Now there are some places, what comes to mind is like Douglas fir and something else that might be in like in Oregon or somewhere, where you might have a couple tree species that are all growing very fine together as intolerant. So they're gonna have a half a dozen mix in there. They're gonna scatter their own seed. They're gonna grow up. We'll see some more pictures. But this is when 20 or more are left as a shelter wood in an uneven aged stand. And it's been opened up so you have some sunlight on the floor, so when the tree grows, they have the sun that the intolerant tree species needs. Here's a seed tree where there's fewer. That's the key difference. Shelter wood is there's more. Seed tree is there's less left in the clear cut. Now, so that, if you can, put that intolerant, even-aged behind you. We're switching over to the other side, which is we're going to talk about uneven-aged management and shade-tolerant species. So here, what we do want is to manage that diversity. We also want to keep the existing trees, but we are going to harvest them. Unless your objective, why would I never want to harvest a tree? What might my objective be if I just wanted to leave it sort of like it was, but kind of help it along a little bit?
If you're growing trees
Yeah, why would we want to keep it instead of cutting them down? I mean, not all at once. I mean,
wait for them to get bigger?
well, say they're already big. They're gonna rot, basically, unless you cut them and harvest them. Say if logging wasn't your, what's that?
It's natural habitat.
Correct. Like if we say wildlife is the only reason, maybe we have our cabin there and we actually want to see rotten logs fall down. So one goal can be to harvest trees, or it could be just for wildlife. And you say that you've got your fire roads already taken care of, so if the fire doesn't come in, you're kind of protected there. But all I want you to know is that there are any kind of number of reasons. And the one thing that's so important about the Nebraska Forest Service is it is up to each person. I don't have an agenda for your property. It's whatever you want, and I help you manage to that.
So how much of Nebraska's forests are managed for lumber or pulp?
I cannot answer that. I wish it were a lot more. Not pulp. We don't have a pulp But we have pallets in the Columbus area, big area for cottonwood. We have pine that's harvested and chipped up at Chadron State College, and also they're trying it at Curtis.
That's just one of Pope and, was it Pope and Talbot used to,
Pope and Talbot, Pope, they went out of business.
see that side?
Yeah, yeah.
And then they have some chip business, like at Columbus along the Platte River.
There's Barton Barcells by Silver Creek,
Yeah.
right. And then up at Springview, we also have a new cedar saw mill up there too, which is awesome. And they're actually shipping cants, like it's a square. That's what they kind of cut a round tree, and then they make it square. So say 8 inches by 8 inches or whatever they can. They're shipping that and putting them in shipping containers and sending them overseas. So cedar is pretty valuable. I mean, so we're trying to get people to, but part of it is, that means that someone actually has to go into the woods and work to log it. And that's work. That's not, sometimes it's on a machine, sometimes it's not. So anyway, so we do have a little bit of an industry, but not so much. Nebraska has probably 80 to 90% privately owned. So there's that opportunity. It's not, state property, state wildlife areas. So back to remove only enough of the canopy to still maintain that shade tolerance. So we don't want to do a clear cut where a tree wants to have the shade. So we got to be careful. And we have multiple ages, and I should have added multiple species here. So the goal here is but we do periodically, in order to enhance that multiple aged, multiple species, we want to help each one do well. Because if we would pack this room with about 200 more people, we wouldn't all get lunch. And that's the problem with these trees too. We still have to allow them to get the resources they need. So periodically, we may go in and make some thinning. We may take out some understory. We may harvest the overstory when that intermediate level gets high enough. So we're constantly, this would have a lot more inputs, constant inputs, as opposed to the other clear cut that would maybe every 80 years you'd do a clear cut and then you just wait 80 years and then you'd cut it again. On this one, every 5 to 10 years you might be going in and doing something constantly. So here, the selection is, these are both shaded, uneven age, they're shade tolerant. We might make a single tree cut, but we could also do a small mini 1 acre size, half acre size group selection cut as well in here, because it is going to be shaded. So here is what the shade tolerant, uneven age management picture actually looks like, which is probably what people think of more when they think of a forest. You go out there and there's a lot of the little stuff and medium stuff and tall stuff. But that could be 3 or 4 or 5 different species in there. So here is one of those mini group selections that was done, say 20 years ago. And now you have some 15-foot tall, 15-year-old spruce growing up in there.
Wouldn't the uneven aged management, like when you do the group selection, be so much more labor intensive? 'Cause
Yes.
you meander around everything.
Exactly. And how do you get it out of there? Yes. So group selection harvests are small clear cuts with a diameter usually less than 2 times the height. So if you have a 50-foot tree, you wouldn't want it any wider than, say, I'm just going to say pick 75 feet. Because you'll have the morning shade and then the afternoon shade. So that's the reason for that. So, and then the single tree That's where, and I've got another step after this to talk about a little bit more differently. But sometimes there are a lot of tree farms across the country, property owners that manage their tree farm, and they set up, they'll work with a consulting forester, and they will actually go in and they may mark each tree, but they may have enough roads, so they'll drop it and then they'll extricate, get it out of there. So depending on the species and the value of the species also determines how you log. So think of walnut. They want to go clear down to that butt log. They'll actually take the dirt away from the root collar and get down below the soil line. So every single tree is going to be valuable, so it's worth it to do, because it's interesting because walnut is supposedly intolerant, but if you're in a walnut forest, it looks pretty shady in there. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. I want to show you, if you look at the left picture, it's kind of out of focus, but the left one shows a forked tree, so that's bad. The next one with an X on it is crooked, et cetera, et cetera. So periodically, in order to maintain in this case, they want to, down the road, log walnut for its wood, not for its nuts. There's a difference. We manage it differently. But if we're going to manage walnut for its wood, we want a straight log. So we want to get rid of the crooked and the low forks. So then you have that left. The other thing to think about on the right is you see this CT means a crop tree. Crop tree is what we actually want to, if we start in this room with 300 trees, eventually we're going to end up maybe with 2 crop trees, one here and one there, when we're all done. It's like thinning carrots. Over time, you keep that competition, shading, different things going on, and then you identify the crop trees you want, and then you get rid of the other ones because they're competing for nutrients and growth for that tree that you finally want to keep. So that's kind of a somewhat similar to how you manage in a shaded. See this one on the middle, top right. What we're trying to do is make it so the sun can come on the side of that whole crown. You're looking at it from the top down, top view. And so when you can eliminate the stuff that's on the left, it goes top left to top right, bottom left to bottom right. All of those trees are crowded. What we're trying to do in this walnut management case is we're trying to keep the other trees from touching, from shading. We want some canopy release because when you increase the canopy, you increase the diameter growth. And when you increase the diameter growth, you have more wood that's merchantable to be sold. So that's how we're trying to grow wood. So what we've got to do first is determine your goals, evaluate what's going on there. Maybe you have a lot of over-mature stuff and bad stuff, but you've got some younger stuff coming up that looks really good. So is it shade tolerant? So if you cut all the overstory stuff out, the trees are going to burn up. How are we going to manage that? We got to figure out what's going on, what type of trees they are. Decide on the treatment and what, maybe there's several treatments to get to our end. So trees is not just an annual corn harvest. Sometimes it's several different inputs for a future 80 years down the road. And we kind of have to think through what each of those are. So treatments can be planting, and I threw in here, this whole talk is kind of generic, but periodically, obviously you guys know the NRD, so I wanted you to think Nebraska here. This obviously is not. We don't fertilize our trees in Nebraska like this, but in the Pacific Northwest, they do put on all those clear cuts, when they plant those seedlings, they do fertilize like that. Because especially the commercial people, like warehouser or whatever. Just think of whoever produces trees for logs and lumber, or down south for pulp. They are going to fertilize. We also have prescribed burning because it will get rid of that understory we don't want competing. And thinning, as I've mentioned a little bit before, is going to result in larger crowns and more leaves because more sunlight gets to that crown. It's going to produce a greater diameter growth. And it also helps because you have thinned trees. Think in your garden, if you had 3 times as many vegetables in there, why do we thin carrots? So we'll have bigger carrots, right? Well, what if we left all the carrots there? We might get some disease. So we try to thin them out so we have healthier trees.
Are there resources we should look at for understanding what those optimum densities are when you're managing, like how much you thin, what's optimal trees per acre, or
You,
varies with species? Probably.
right, and you wouldn't need to know that. But what I would do is, one of the ideal things, because I was just talking to Jeannie about going to the national contest is at Pocatello, Idaho. So, what are their forests there? So I would research and look for their Idaho State Forestry and see where they talk about what their forests are. And one word that I didn't mention specifically here under the resource part, but stewardship. So what we try to do to help someone that comes under the guidelines of stewardship is basically the silvicultural plan, to do a silviculture on a sustainable basis. So you could see, okay, now here in Idaho, and I have no idea what, say I'm going to throw out pine. They might have lodgepole pine in some places. What do they need on there? There is generally one of the things that we talk about is the stocking rate, is the number of trees per acre. I don't expect the students to know that. We talk about what is it, how do you figure it out, how to use it, and that's that prism, the use of that prism. So it's more of mathematical function of just the trees that we see at a state contest site.
So they figured out that basal area, but they don't have to know what practices, should it be thinned or not?
Right, no. But what they might, why are trees thinned? Why are trees harvested? How come the trees couldn't be harvested? What interrupted the harvest? Fire, urban sprawl, livestock. They may want to know why. It would be helpful to know why things. Why are they not? Is it not happening? So this one is basically, I think that is up in the Pine Ridge. So if you look up here, just a real quick question, what would you see here? What do you see there?
That one with all the branches has got to be.
On the left?
Yeah.
Exactly. Boy, if I had a candy bar or some gold star, you'd get it today. That's exactly right. It is not going to produce anything. Now that would be, what is his objective there? Have nice straight trees, right? What if you were a property owner that says, I want birds here, I want grasses here, whatever. What if, so it depends on, if I wanted grasses, they'd all be gone, right? I'd clear cut it and let the grass stay. What if I wanted winter cover for deer? What would I do? Let more grow? Keep some of them? So that's your objective, is what are we going to do with that, okay? So here are some of the thinning, finally we're getting down to some of the thinning pictures. We talk about a pre-commercial because you don't get money for thinning stuff so small. You actually sometimes just leave it on the ground and it breaks down and becomes nutrients back in the soil. But that's a small 15 to 20 to 30 foot tall trees. And so we go, that's the thinning carrot stages. Where we cut, we might have 300 trees, we cut them down to 150. The next time we go in, we cut it down to 50 and then maybe 20 per acre. That all takes time and money. So you also have to factor that in.
Now, do they still pay in western Nebraska then for thinning like this?
We do have, the Nebraska Forest Service has some programs basically because of fire reduction. So we're trying to also prune up so that the fire can burn on the ground and not get into a crown fire, because we're trying to save the ponderosa pine before it goes away. So then you can go in and do a commercial thinning, and that's when you've got a log that can be sawed into boards. And that depends on each species, is going to be different, what size they are. But that's a commercial thinning. And then the black walnut may be pruned because we want clear lumber, things like that. And here's the resources. When I was looking for some information, I saw Discover the Forest, and I thought that was kind of cool. They talk about there is a natural inquirer, and I think it's research that comes from the U.S. Forest Service, but it sounded like something that you could have access to. So I just thought you might want to check it out. So that is it. I'm done. Sorry, Nadine, I don't know how I went on time. But I hope that if you do find as you study, when you take a turn to forestry, if you do have questions, please pass them on to either me, obviously, but when you get ready for teacher training or anything else, please let Erica know so she can say, hey, Rachel, they've been asking for this.